Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. Welcome to Universidad del Rosario. Buenos días a todos y todas. Bienvenidos a la Universidad del Rosario. Universidad del Rosario was established in 1653, and since then, it has characterized not only for constructing the history of Colombia, but also for encouraging critical thinking among his students, not giving for granted reality, and being aware of current and past injustices. Not in vain, the first Colombian independence campaign was planned and led by alumni from this university. And many of the most renowned Colombian lawyers and scholars working in international law have studied in this university. Today, we're co-hosting this wonderful event that is the most important event on critical approaches to international law in the region. And we have the privilege to have with us Professor Ann Orford, Anthony Yangi, and Marty Koskaniemi, plus more than 70 scholars from more than 15 countries around the world. We're happy and proud to co-host this event with our partners, Universidad de los Andes, Universidad Externado de Colombia. Special thanks to our friends and colleagues, Paola Costa, José Manuel Álvarez, René Ureña, Liliana Obregón, Laura Betancourt, and for all the logistic teams that have supported this event, Daniel Rivas, Daniel Quiroga, Natalia Delgado, Carolina Torres. Let me highlight and repeat this. This is your university, and we hope you have a wonderful day today. If you have some questions, then you will find people from the university that will be ready to answer your queries or questions. Before we begin, I'd like to say a few words. Today is the second day of this wonderful conference, and today's topic is history from about international law in Latin America. As stated by Oscar Guardiola Rivera, international law is understood as a discipline that deals with the order of foundations, power, generations, the making of territory, war, and international order. In this context, lawyers and some scholars tend to focus on treaties, clauses that rule the relationship between states, judicial decisions, and the technocratic materialization of international law. In this context, the history of international law tends to be reduced to some particular events, beginning with the Peace of Westphalia as the mythical event of the appearance of modern international law, passing through the two world wars, and the establishment of the League of Nations and the UN, among other relevant events. However, this orthodox approach in telling the history of international law creates some blind spots. It does not tell us about acts of colonialism, massive destruction of culture, slavery, epistemological imposition, and plunder. The question that we need to ask is whether scholars from the South should engage or challenge this orthodox approach, especially if accepting and engaging with this orthodox approach will seem to materialize what Frantz Fanon accurately expressed, saying that the intellectuals of the periphery tend to be ready to defend the Greco-Latin pedestal and ideals. In this context, the invitation for today's session is to critically think about histories about international law from and in Latin America, and critically assess the relevance and the necessity of creating alternative narratives and different approaches to international law. We have here Professors Anthony Yangi, Marty Koskaniemi, and Ann Orford, who have challenged those orthodox accounts of international law. Perhaps we need to move from the Peace of Westphalia to the 1550 debates of Valladolid. For pursuing this conversation, this panel will be led by three of my colleagues, So we have Professor Marco Velázquez from Universidad Javeriana. We have Professor José Manuel Álvarez from Universidad Externa de Colombia, and we have Jimena that will be joining us. She's from Universidad External and Universidad del Rosario. So I would like to thank again all of you for joining us here at Universidad del Rosario, and please feel free to walk around. There is a sort of museum in this university, and then we'll have the coffee break. We'll have coffee outside this room, and then in the afternoon we will move to different rooms. And before stepping down from here, I would like to bring some general question to the panel, and then I step down, and I let my colleagues to continue with this conversation. But my question is, what is the relevance of creating a narrative of the past of international law from the perspective of the third world, trying to unveil blind spots in the construction and materialization of international law? In other words, to make it simple, the question is whether we should think and build a historical narrative of international law from the third world. Perhaps I would like to ask Professor Mati or Anne to start with this answer, and then I will ask my colleagues to continue with this conversation. Thank you so much, and I will see you throughout the day. Thank you.
Want to think about the history of international law if we're engaged in a critical project of rethinking international law, and in this case, from this region, Latin America. So let me answer very briefly in a way that might set up some of my position in response to the discussion for the next 2 hours. My interest in producing new or different accounts about the past of international law is because of the way I understand my role as a critical international lawyer. So when I say critical, this discussion came up, I think, yesterday to a degree in our conversation around cynicism or skepticism. So I'm using the term critical in a form different to that seemed to be suggested by the notion of cynicism. As a good lawyer, I know we have a jurisdictional arrangement where tomorrow we talk about critique, but I can't really explain how I think about history without just briefly explaining what I mean by critique. I'll do it more fully tomorrow. So I mean critique not in the sense that I'm a critic of, that I want to point out the ways in which international law fails or what's wrong with it or why we shouldn't be idealistic about it, but rather in the sense I understand my position as an international lawyer, committed to thinking about how my role can play a part in social transformation and understanding that the situation in which I find myself as an academic in a country like Australia is something that I have to be able to take into account when I think about the knowledge that I produce. So when I think about the past of international law, I'm thinking about it as an international lawyer interested in engaging in critique in that way. And as a result, I then engage with the past of international law because that's how international lawyers work. That is how international law operates. International law is a form of knowledge, a discipline, a profession, a practice, an institution that is organised around engaging with the past and interpreting the past in a way that is aimed at bringing about a different kind of future. So that movement of concepts, of ideas, of precedents is absolutely core to the work of international lawyers. And for all of us involved either as teachers or as students or as scholars of international law, we will be working with past texts all the time. So legal education, legal training is in large part organised around teaching students how to engage with these highly condensed forms of politically volatile material that we turn into legal concepts or legal fictions and hand on from hand to hand, so that we stop finding them something that we have to debate and react to with moral outrage every time we're presented with what self-defence actually turns out to mean, or what collective security turns out to be about, or what the most favoured nation principle in fact does in the world. We teach these really complex philosophical arguments, we condense them into legal concepts, we hand them on in judgments, in treaties, in classrooms, in interpretations, and we go to work with that material in a highly adversarial situation where we have a great deal at stake. Finally, we do that in a field that is organised around teleological accounts of where the law is heading, and every argument we make that tries to talk about purpose, even if it's just the purpose of a treaty, let alone the purpose of our field, will have that quality to it. And if we want to show that the other person is wrong and that their sense of the vision of the future isn't the one we will take into account, then we'll also go to work on the field of history, but this time we'll do it to show that actually the Monroe Doctrine wasn't really about this, it was about that. Actually, if we pay proper attention to the historical record, we'll see it was always anti-imperial, or maybe it was always imperial. It was always about dominating the region, or was it about freeing the region? Whatever argument we take, it will have political stakes in the present, and it will go to work through trying to move meaning through history. So I can come back later to how I think that differs from what a proper historian would do, but that is why I think we necessarily produce and engage with narratives about the past all the time.
Okay, so there is a risk, of course, that we will be repeating a little bit what we say each other and what we have said yesterday, and then tomorrow we will be repeating what we say today. But in a situation, in a jamboree like these 3 days, that I suppose can't be really avoided. So the opening question, of course, was formulated in a very general fashion. I think it invites us, and it certainly, that's how Anne understood it, invites us in some ways to say a few general words about how one, as somebody who's known of as and thinks of themselves as a critical person, how come they turn to history? Why would it be that history is interesting or important? What work does it do? And why would somebody want to think about the past instead of thinking about the future? Those kinds of general things I can't avoid, and as I said, I suppose we can't avoid a little bit of repetition there either. So I suppose later on we'll be more saying a few more words about the relationship with our present engagement in a world which, as I said yesterday and many others said, is terribly unjust, and how the engagement with today invites us to think about the past. Why is it that to be an effective actor in the struggles that we have today, we need to have some sort of a view about what we think about the past, and also an account of what that past is, what it means to us. One way, but it's just one way to add to what Anne said about the relationship between the present struggles and accounts about the past, one way that those things relate to each other has to do with ridding ourselves of the present narratives that seem to bind us to a very limited set of alternatives that there are today. One way in which the present world keeps going and its institutions continue is that they build upon assumptions that we've come here through a natural process and that the institutional alternatives that we've chosen, the institutional hierarchies in which we live, that they reflect a history that's naturally ended up here and that it couldn't really have ended up in any other way. Now, as long as one thinks in those terms, then one's frame of what alternatives are open in the present and for the future is very limited, is very constrained. We are bound to thinking of the present because it's natural also as somehow unavoidable and acceptable. Now, one of the things that historical research does automatically and very rapidly and efficiently is to dispel and destroy the illusion of the necessity of the present. And it will show us, for example, in my own work, I've been astonished at, for the present I am trying desperately as a person educated in public law and in public international law to look at how private law, and especially the law of property, how that has structured our thinking about the international. And I didn't know much about property, the history of property law earlier on, and when I started to examine that and to look in different places of the world, in different legal regimes of property, what one found was a huge variety of arrangements and institutional decisions about how material and spiritual goods should be allocated within society between people. And once you then pursue that kind of study, the past becomes a source of different kinds of arrangements. The past becomes a series of narratives about those different kinds of arrangements. It also becomes then a source in the present, so that you can think that, well, the arrangement about properties or institutional hierarchies that we have actually doesn't have the kind of necessity that we think of it on an everyday basis, but that it is a really complex and in some ways strange result of arbitrary, more or less arbitrary decisions that people in authoritative places have made at certain moments, and we've ended up here. Whereas had those decisions been made as they did this in that other context, on that context, we could have a wholly different kind of property law or a series of arrangements about social hierarchy, etc. So to condense this first point, and I'm not going to pursue more at this point, is that, well, for somebody who thinks of themselves as critical, and that criticalness of one's self-identification has to do with the view that the world is a terribly unjust place, the merit of historical work lies in the way it opens up alternatives to think about the present, that the present isn't necessarily as it seems to be, that it's a series of choices that have been made by people, choices that could have been taken in other ways, and also provides us with alternatives for choices now and blueprints as to how we could move ahead from this situation that in some ways is so grossly unacceptable, especially if one thinks of the world from the perspective of the South. In that sense, the present and the past are ineradicably tied together in critical work and in critical engagements.
Thanks, Mark. Well, once again, thanks very much for hosting us at this beautiful university. History is power. I mean, we are living in the midst of all these controversies about what sorts of statues should be allowed to dominate the public landscape. There are all sorts of questions of that sort taking place right now. So, I mean, Anne and Marty wonderfully presented the way in which, well, time, the past is the present, and we can't help engaging with that past. And the people who control the past actually control, in many respects, our identities, what we see as our political horizons. They create the traditions that we feel we must participate in if we are to establish ourselves as credible professionals within the field and the discipline. So the past has all these effects. The past also suggests, or depending on how the past is written, the past also suggests the questions that we as international lawyers should be engaged in exploring. So one claim I would make is that we see in a Eurocentric international law a focus on particular events which then become somehow abstracted into the major theoretical issues which the discipline should focus on. So there could be an argument made, for example, that if Westphalia is the central event in the history of international law, that is the event that then creates the problem of how is order to be established among equal and sovereign states. Now, in that time, it didn't acquire quite the same character because there was natural law still somewhere in place. But when we arrive at the moment of positivism, we come to this huge issue of is international law really law, and how can order be established among equal and sovereign states? So that's a moment where you could say a very specific local, in a way, event is transformed into a theoretical question, which then comes to dominate our discipline. So I would claim that most of the great international lawyers of the last century have attempted to resolve this issue. Lauterpacht in his own way, Tom Frank, legitimacy is the answer, and so forth. So where do we as critical international lawyers try to challenge these types of narratives, and why should we do that? So perhaps I'll go back to the little story I began with yesterday, the story about the apple. And the situation where somebody growing up in a colony has a memory of taking an apple to his teacher at school. And this in a situation where apples do not grow in the country in which he lives. And so this is a representative of this problem of how we in different locations try to understand our own history. How do we in the Caribbean, in Colombia, in Sri Lanka, how do we try to come to terms with our place in the world? What language, what vocabulary do we use for these purposes? And so in an imagination which is colonized, the language that is available is the language of the colonizer. And so I think in this context, critique takes the form of trying to develop a vocabulary that is adequate for the purposes of understanding and explaining our own reality. Now, there are lots of complex issues even embedded in that issue, because I think for many of us, particularly in the class that we come from, we actually have a choice of deciding whether we want to identify with the colonizer, even though we have been colonized. There's that paradox, which Fanon dealt with extensively. Because I think we all come from very fairly wealthy elite backgrounds. And so somehow we could construct ourselves as being part of that language of civilization. And then our task is to apply it to various others that we want to identify as the uncivilized. And this is perhaps an experience that was felt especially acutely in Latin America. It was felt in all colonized countries, or whether we identify with the colonized, even though we ourselves have been the colonized. And so the question is, how do we find this alternative vocabulary? So that was the challenge, I think, that many third world international lawyers have been trying to grapple with. And one response is to create a history in which we would say, well, we too have a form of civilized law. We too have had systems of governance. We too understand the significance of treaties and the immunity of ambassadors and so forth. I think the post-colonial move is to really say, well, we've got to try and focus and create our own vocabulary. But this creates huge problems. Where is that vocabulary to come from? And so, maybe we can connect this with literature and Marquette, trying to find a language to communicate the reality, a very different type of reality. And this is the problem, of course, that Dipesh Chakrabarty also points to when he talks about saying the history of every country is really a reproduction of Western history. Because we are using the paradigm, the concepts that underlie and structure Western history in order to understand our own histories. So where do we find this alternative vocabulary from? So that is a difficulty. And I think this is a challenge that all of us trying to work on this issue have attempted to deal with. So one approach is to say, well, if we take imperialism as the central issue of international law, and my claim yesterday was that imperialism is not out there, it is not something external that we should begin to engage with, it is here, it is part of our lives. And the challenge then is to identify the way in which imperialism and its aftermath, if there is such a thing, continues to affect our lives, continues to construct who we are, continues in various ways to shape the fundamentals of the foreign investment regime. I mean, you can see the relationship, if we have any historical sense at all, between capitulations and the foreign investment regime. So I suppose my technique then was to try to think about moments where it is imperialism that is rather than see that as incidental, try to focus on certain events and unpack what happens in those events. So 1492 might be one way to begin. Victoria, the writings of Victoria may be one way to begin, to see what is it that even Western international lawyers, how do they represent this moment, and what can we learn from the way in which they represent this moment? And I think in that context, we can learn from Victoria, although it seems that we keep learning from Victoria. I mean, Marty's written this wonderful piece. I hadn't really thought about all those issues. So Victoria seems to continuously provide this rich variety of techniques and ideas, and that itself is very interesting. But in Victoria, for example, the moment of the colonial encounter, we can see how issues of property, of legal personality, of war, of trade, of race, all these things combine in very complex ways. And then the question would be, all right, let's see if studying that moment, we can come across, at least formulate some rough paradigms, which we might then proceed to take forward in trying to understand the rest of the history of international law. And so this is a way in which developing countries or the colonized might actually engage directly with the colonial experience, even if it is presented by the major Western scholars, to say, well, what were the techniques used? And can we see those techniques being reproduced in some way? Let's see whether we can formulate a different vocabulary by which to try and engage with the history of international law. So for me, for example, the idea of the civilized and uncivilized was one theme that one could take, even though, as Liliana quite rightly points out, it wasn't until the 17th or 18th century that civilization, at least in the Western understanding of that term, came into existence. But this issue of cultural difference, then let's use that term. Can we use that as a paradigm through which we can study the history of international law? Perhaps in the case of South America, or Latin America, Liliana suggested Creole international law. Is that a way in which to understand the specificities, the uniqueness of this experience? So I think that's perhaps one way to try and understand both why it is important to write these counter-histories and to develop a set of analytical tools that will reveal a different aspect, a different dimension of international law. I see this process as not being the writing of the history of international law as such, but for me, it's more like a heuristic device. Can we see this technology of power in operation? How can we see this? I believe there's a system of power that has been developed through the colonial encounter. And can we see how this expands and refines, and what the events are which seem to continue this whole process? And that creates what I would argue is a history of continuity, rather than a history of sharp breaks where we shift from naturalism to positivism and so forth. So I've already gone on for longer than I wanted to, but those are just some rough thoughts to begin with.
Thank you very much. So I think I will start formulating a couple of questions for the three of you. I will try to localize a little bit more the questions we have. We have plenty of questions, of course, because this is a huge opportunity for us who are actually working on international legal history. And please forgive me if I start with a small anecdote in order to introduce my questions. Around 10 years ago, I was a Latin American student at Geneva doing a master's in international law. And I had taken a course on the philosophy and history of international law given by Professor Peter Hagenmacher. I think you have heard of him. Of course, his style was a bit different, and he used to tell us that the history of international law was the history of civilization, how civilized cultures were able to beat barbarism, and how this idea of progress was unavoidable, and that somehow we were going there. And he was normally looking at us Latin American students when he was saying that. Of course, I learned a lot from him, but after I took that course, it was my first winter in Europe. Of course, I wasn't used to, the cold and the fact that most of my classmates left home. I had to stay there. And the only thing I could do back then was to go to the library. And then that was when I was looking at the history section of the library of HAI in Geneva. And I had the chance to come across books that back then you had already written. And I had the chance to understand that history could be told in a different way, the history of international law. So having said that, well, I have two questions that I have from those times, and I still have, and I'm not going to lose the chance to formulate them. The first one is historiographical. So Professor Obregon, who's right there, in a recent piece wrote or discussed that discussing on the challenges and opportunities around the writing of international legal history. Said that the way historians discuss and write about international law is different from the way international lawyers narrate the history of the discipline. So having that in mind, what could us jurists contribute from, what could us jurists brought from the discipline of history to address the writing of international legal history? And in the same way, what could historians learn from us to advance on the writing of history? That's the first question. And the second one is about the future of the discipline in Latin America, because so far we already have a very important amount of literature on international legal history in and from Latin America. We have the works of Liliana Obregón, Arnulf Becker Lorca, Luis Eslava, Juan Pablo Scarfi, and so on. But which do you think should be the next move? Should we keep working on general history of international law, or maybe should we move towards more particular areas and keep doing critical history, but perhaps in particular areas of the discipline? Thank you.
Okay, two simple questions, but thank you for them. They're very rich. So the first question about the relation of international law and history. So this is a question that has been interesting me for some time, in part because this overlap of various kinds of historical work, intellectual history, disciplinary history, history of empire, global history, with international law has been, as we all know, and as many people in this room have contributed to, a hugely productive site of work over the past decade. So that encounter is one that's been productive, but also, it seemed to me, fraught in some ways methodologically. And the methodological problem arose precisely at around this question of what are the protocols, the appropriate protocols for engaging with past texts. So we heard Christopher Rossi bring this up yesterday in the invocation of Whig history, this notion that Whig history is something that to which we are opposed. Already we can hear that we've been invited into a very kind of particular discussion, because most of us don't have any enemies who are Whigs. Whigs are actually people who were part of a particular polity on the other side of the world. So we're already being invited into a discussion that comes out of a moment in English history where there is a modernist pushback against certain narratives that seek to prop up monarchy, the Anglican Church, and that have very little to do with, life in other parts of the world. So why would we be invited into a conversation about England in the early 20th century? So partly that's because that conversation about England in the early 20th century was taken up quite late, in fact, in terms of historical thinking, by Quentin Skinner and other people who are roughly characterised as the Cambridge School. This idea about how we think about the past was brought into intellectual history. So to just really briefly explain to people who aren't caught up in the minutiae of this debate why we should care about that, the argument there is in one way one that would seem really uncontroversial. To do historical work well, and lawyers would agree with this, we have all sorts of rules in international law that explain how we think about and how we judge a past event. We would want to think about the event or the person or the doctrine in the context in which it is articulated. So that seems to be uncontroversial. But the complication for lawyers, as I tried to sketch in my opening remark, is that that is not how international law operates. So there is not just one context in which a concept or even a rule or a principle is articulated. Lawyers work by handing on concepts and principles and doctrines, by re-articulating them in new situations, by arguing about which interpretation of a rule or even which event is the appropriate one to which we should be referring. And this was one example of this from my own experience. Of late, was sitting on a panel with Harold Coe discussing how we should think about Syria. And I gave a small paper explaining how we should think about Syria in the context of Nicaragua. Why is that? Well, that's partly because many of the same people, as it happens, were advising the US government in terms of developing a strategy of proxy war in Latin America in the 1970s and 80s, as were advising the US government in developing a strategy of proxy war in the Middle East in our current time. So actually, some of those players, including Harold Coe, move across those two sets, those two time periods. But also, Nicaragua was important because, as we all know, it's a moment where newly independent states had been working for about a decade, building on the tradition that had emerged in Latin America in the early part of the 20th century to articulate what non-intervention might mean if decolonisation was to be a real phenomenon. And the result of that juridical work, the high point of that juridical work, was the decision of Nicaragua against the US in the International Court of Justice in 1986. So if you read what's happening in the Middle East through the Nicaragua judgment, it's like looking at another planet. Almost nothing that the International Court of Justice says in Nicaragua would seem to be the way that the situation in the Middle East today is being understood in terms of when and whether and how it's lawful to finance, support, train, direct, or otherwise encourage rebel groups operating in another country. So what does that tell us? Well, we would have to think about how it is and to what extent the principle of non-intervention has been transmitted across that period. How has it been transformed? How is the function of a principle in 1986 different to the function of a principle in 2017, 2018? And how do we make sense of that transformation? We can't say there is one context in which the principle of non-intervention must be understood, nor is there one author, nor is there one event. And as it happens, Harold Coe, when I finished, said very politely, unfortunately, Professor Orford has chosen the wrong precedent. The right precedent was Kosovo. So there we are. Now, we could say, I'm sorry, both of you are wrong. You can't invoke past events or texts. We can only talk about Syria in the present tense. That is the appropriate context. And that is, in fact, what Herbert Butterfield said in The Whig Interpretation of History. Butterfield said his problem was not just that you have to think about events in their, or texts, in fact not texts, events in their context, but that the other serious problem of Whig history was what he called the problem of abridgement. Now that is a really kind of odd word, and the more you read this Whig interpretation of history, the more this notion of abridgement becomes front and centre. So it's like he'd taken a set against the Reader's Digest. He was really upset with abridging things, abridging history. And so not only did he think you shouldn't talk about events outside their context, but you really couldn't add all those contexts together. You really could only think about the world in these fragments. Now that's a pretty radical proposition, even if what you're talking about is a history of events. But if what you're talking about is a history of ideas, a history of concepts, an intellectual history, that is an extremely radical proposition. And that is the proposition that Quentin Skinner makes in his Meaning and Understanding in the History of Ideas. So, as I said to Marty, the chapter that I've been writing for him on this is now 80,000 words and growing, but it's precisely because I think there is a really serious problem if we are to tell international lawyers that they have to think about the past as if they were contextual historians. On the other hand, contextual history is vitally important, and I'll talk about this when I'm on the panel to launch Juan Pablo Scarfi's book later on. And that book and the work that people were talking about yesterday is enormously important for international lawyers trying to make arguments about the history of the principle of non-intervention, but not if those arguments are to be taken out of the present tense context in which that principle and that history of regionalism continues to do incredibly important work. The future of the discipline in Latin America and what should be the next move, it seems improper for me to tell the people in this room what should be the next move in terms of the history of Latin America. But I suppose what I would say is that in terms of my own work and the work of the people, that brilliant people, including a number of people from Latin America working with me in Melbourne, we are working on a big project on civil war intervention and international law, thinking about how these notions of intervention have been transformed over time. Fabia Vesoso and Sebastian Machado, who are both here, are working on that project. And of course, thinking about the region of Latin America, which is the focus of Fabia's work, is extremely important to make sense of a concept like non-intervention. It would not be possible to produce any account of what that principle means and does in the world today without thinking about this complex history of what it's meant in Latin America.
Okay, so I mean, as regard the first question, the relations of international law and history, there's really nothing that one can add to what Anne said. So those were real words of wisdom, and I've learned so much. She's been saying that in slightly different words for now some time, learned so much from that. So the initial invitation to lawyers, international lawyers, to become more historical and to do historical work, I think was a good and it was a fruitful invitation that has led to brilliant and interesting and important research in many ways, but it has also muddled the grounds of methodology, if one can say, put it in those terms, and lawyers have become terribly anxious as to, well, we are, as historians, we're always amateurs, and we're always second-rate historians. It's really embarrassing to be in a conference among historians if one is expected to do in those conferences what historians do. Of course, we can't do as well as they do in their own circles. But let me put these two questions together. The question about what should one do in Latin America and in the world now, and what's the relationship between historians and international lawyers. So what is to be done? So the big question that has surprised me, that hasn't been posed over and over again when the history question emerges, is this. What is the history of international law a history of? How should we answer that question? Most people take that as a simple question and then produce some sort of a response, as if it were clear what international law is. Now, we've all gone through jurisprudence classes. We don't have to have gone through that, but we've gone through that. And we've had conversations with lawyers, and the most brilliant of those lawyers are the ones who are most confused about what law is. And we read in thick books long and complex narratives about how we can imagine what law is. Is law a set of practices that people have adopted, a kind of a sociological, is it a sociological moment of this world? Or is it ideas? Is it something that people imagine into existence? Is it a series of institutional processes? And how do those processes relate to the facts from which they emerge and the ideas that carry them forward, etc.? So those are the bread and water of debates among lawyers about what law is. Now, all those questions and a zillion other equally complex questions are embedded in any answer to the question, what is the history of international law a history of? There has emerged a tendency among historians of international law to believe that history of international law is a self-evident thing. It's like a car that comes around the corner. Oh, here it is, my taxi. And then you go into the taxi and you drive into the night. But it's not like that. It's not like that. And we have, in the course of roughly 150 years, developed a certain way of addressing that question. Westphalia is one of the things that has to be in our response to that question. Well, the League of Nations, the United Nations, the turn to institute. So we have all of that we have there, and that's it's not a very well-developed or varied genre. It's sometimes rather predictable and boring genre. And I want that to change. So the legal imagination itself has produced a number of sophisticated, interesting, passionate accounts of what law is. Why wouldn't we use those accounts when we start to answer the question, what is the history of international law a history of? It's not just that it's in a Schmittian, Grevean fashion, the history of empires successively following each other. The Spanish Empire collapses into the French Empire, collapses into the British Empire, collapses into what Schmitt delightfully calls the Anglo-American condominium empire in the 20th century. So that's one narrative, and there are all kinds of problems about that, but it's all kinds of insights as well. But we know that already. Or then that it's about institutions following each other. So it starts with the unions, the international unions in the 19th century. They grow up in the League of Nations, etc. So it's there as well. But none of that is very interesting. We need to know that. None of this has much to do with what historians think about law or international law. They learn from us. So far, they haven't learned very well from us. We should be able to teach them better what law is in its manifoldedness, in its imagination. So there are two things. I could, go on, and you see with that. I kind of, a door has been opened in which I need to be clear that I have to close the door because otherwise we'll be sitting here until the lunchtime. But there are two things I want to say. One is that what needs to be done in Latin America now, in terms of thinking about legal history, is to be clear that as an interesting series of questions and accounts, it should be a it should have to do and concentrate on power. These histories are interesting only to the extent they tell us something about how power is used, how authoritative men and women use language and operate in institutions, governmental and non-governmental, etc., in order to exercise power, to grasp power, to oppose power, how they operate with power. So it's not that we tell these narratives for aesthetic reasons. And sometimes it seems to me that historians get lost in their aesthetic ambition. And some of these stories are really passionate stories, and we lose ourselves when we think about the conquest of, for example, a number of passionate, fascinating stories, and we tell those stories forgetting what's really interesting and important in them is how power is being used by some people over other people. So power. We need to, when we deal with international legal history in Latin America, but also elsewhere, we need to remember that we deal with the history of how power has been used. And my second point is about legal imagination. So lawyers use their own craftsmanship through imaginatively using all of these alternatives that the legal discourse offers to them. The alternative of thinking of law as a series of practices. The alternative of thinking of law as a series of highfalutin ideas. Law is a work of constant imagining and reimagining. One way in which legal imagination has become stale is that it has come to believe that its own distinctions, public and private, you can see where I'm going, public and private are kind of eternal entities. They are two taxis following each other, and we have to choose which one in which we sit because the directions are different. No, of course, it's not like that. We constantly reproduce through our imagination those kinds of distinctions. And now the history of international law should look at how it is that we make those distinctions. It shouldn't take those distinctions as given to us and they'll tell the narratives of each one of these. So a narrative of, let's say, sovereignty as the narrative of something that's out there. Instead, it should tell how come we think of sovereignty in the ways that we do. And in order for us to answer that question, we should know what's outside the boundaries of sovereignty. Now I'm coming to what my punchline, I suppose, is in this rant of 10 minutes. So what is the history of international law a history of? It's a history of how lawyers have used power through the various complex mechanisms which they have. I think at the heart of those mechanisms, at least one very important part of those mechanisms, is the way in which we've linked sovereignty and property together. And that now we should, if we are interested in power, the way in which law has operated through power, now we should examine and tell the story of how sovereignty and property, ownership and jurisdiction, money and government have related to each other in the course of history. What are the specific configurations that lawyers, through their legal imagination, have told us that is the natural relationship that those two forms of power, the private power and public power, have with each other, and how they have been formulated and reformulated over and over again in specific periods. And to end at some point, because I know I need to end, you'll be glad to hear, is to say, well, we need those accounts in order to free ourselves from the present set of assumptions that the way in which the relations of sovereignty and property today are organized, the way in which private and public power today are organized, the way in which states and companies today relate to each other has some naturalness about them. It doesn't. And for critical lawyers who want to have an influence on how state power and corporate power operate, it's extremely important to know what the alternatives are. And those alternatives are only open to us if our historical understanding tells us that the history of international law is the history of how lawyers have imaginatively used those concepts that have been given to them to use.
Thanks. There is not that much more for me to say, but let me try and formulate a few thoughts. The relationship between history and international law. So I would divide my own experience into two different phases. So there was the first phase, which I would call the innocent phase. And in the innocent phase, I was interested in history. In fact, at one time, I might have become a historian, except that I come from an Asian background, and the question I would have had to deal with then is, how are you going to earn a living as a historian? So studying law gave me a sort of alibi to engage in my interest in history while appearing to do something useful. But I loved history, and so I read it, and I cite various historians in my work. And this was in a moment of innocence where I thought there was some sort of happy cooperation. And after all, intellectually as well, we can see that surely the great themes we deal with, property, civilization, sovereignty, these are themes that have been dealt with by historians as well as by international lawyers. And of course, in a much earlier phase, these distinctions, these disciplinary distinctions would not have made sense. So Grotius is all over the place. I mean, if we think in terms of what is he? I mean, is he, how should we categorize him, as a political theorist or as an international lawyer or as a theologian even in some respects? So this was the happy, innocent moment. And I used history in a very naive way in my work. And frankly, I am glad I did. Because now that all the great methodological debates have emerged, I find myself encountering more and more unhappy doctoral students who feel they've got to wade through these huge methodological debates before they can actually say anything. And I think that is a huge, that's unfortunate. And this is somehow the situation in which we find ourselves. But I would like to think that this wasn't always the case. I don't know quite how to describe what happened. So there's a moment when I think, I'm not sure how Marty and Anne feel about this, but I felt there was this moment when there was a wonderful confluence, a meeting in a way of international law, intellectual history, global history was emerging, regional history was trying to rethink itself. And so there's this wonderful moment, and it seemed we would have this amazing carnival or jubilee or whatever you want to call it. And then it was like a bad date or something like that, where everybody rushed to the party and then found they hated each other and really couldn't get along. And methodology was the major complication here. But I would also say that it wasn't, I don't think we want to make too much of it, although I don't know how to think about it. Because on one hand, what can I say? Some of my best friends are historians. I don't know how to put it. I mean, we continue to engage in interesting and helpful ways with many historians. But somehow this methodological debate seems to have taken over that entire engagement. And I think that's really unfortunate. And I don't know how to explain it or how to undo it. It really is another apple story. We've eaten of the apple this time, and now we find ourselves, in this morass and not knowing quite how to deal with it. So in terms of then we come to this moment of contextual history. And I try to explain why it is I turn to history. And it's pretty, Anne gave a wonderful account of, the way lawyers use history. And I would say that, in a way, is a very accurate account of my own experience in why I turn to history. In engaging in something very practical, which is preparing a case that was to be argued before the International Court of Justice. That's why I turned to history. And then, of course, when I focused on the scholarly enterprise, then I looked at that history in a somewhat different way. But I was still affected by this issue of how power works. So then let's focus on contextual history. I mean, Anne's given a wonderful account of some of the complications attached to that. I think my uncertainty or reservations about it are more sort of basic and unthought. But I found, for example, that contextual history, at least the contextual history I read, didn't really deal in a very, to me anyway, illuminating way with issues of power, issues of empire. Even when some of these people were talking about, or some of these studies were about people writing on issues of, or people who were engaged in the imperial project in all sorts of ways. So that was one factor. The other complication, I think, with contextual history is it's possible to get it wrong. And if your subject happens to be alive, then it could become very embarrassing. So, Marty has been placed by a contextual historian in a particular context as having certain views. The complication is that Marty is now in a position to say, as he did, I'm sorry, actually, that's not the way I think. And so this raises a lot of complications about this paradox where contextual history seems to be more sensitive, more attuned, more alive to the truth, and it's not. And then you wonder how, is Grotius around to say, well, that's the wrong reading of me? Can we see the problem? I mean, the other interesting question is, well, okay, if I'm anachronistic, I'd like to think Grotius is too. I mean, look at the way he uses Seneca. Look at the way he uses those sources. I mean, is he contextually sensitive in that, in the way that he deals with all those sources? And Grotius, of course, was a genius, so maybe he knew the context in which all these, different manuscripts were written, and the Latin authors, and the Greek authors, and the ancient, etc. So you can see some of the complications, if we were to think of this term. But as I said, I don't want this methodological debate to dominate the way in which we engage in interdisciplinary work. I think most of the historians I meet say, well, actually, we are doing something different, but it's really interesting to talk to you, and I find it interesting to talk to them. I mean, people like Lauren Benton and so forth. So that's, I think, what I would say about history and international law. And as I said, I'm going to continue to be, in my writing, I'm trying to escape history, but it's a difficult thing to escape history, and maybe my whole argument is you can't escape history. So I'm trying to defy my own argument in a way. But I find somehow that everything I write now, even if I don't want it to be, has a historical dimension. And I think we can understand why that is the case. So, but I'm going to continue to be naive. I'm going to try and reproduce that moment of innocence before this methodological debate in my writing, even in the future. And if I'm going to be criticized for that, so be it. But I'd like to think that maybe it's more useful to say something and try to develop an ambitious argument about these great themes that we deal with and which govern our lives, rather than aim at some sort of illusion of methodological purity or methodology. What is the right methodology? I think that's really a debate that doesn't help us very much. And I'm sorry for those doctoral students who feel that they've got to engage with this debate. The far more important thing is to say something interesting about the great themes that we all should be engaged with. Okay, second question about regionalism in Latin America. Again, like Anne, I feel very reluctant to say anything about this. I'm inspired by Liliana, who I think in our generation is the pioneering scholar in the field of the history of international law. So I don't really know why she's not up here and why we are, but it's Liliana who should be addressing this in some way. But let me try and address it another way. So I'm involved with the Asian Society of International Law. The society was created in 2007. So of course, once we create an Asian Society of International Law, then we have to think, well, what is Asian international law anyway? So we can see how a kind of an institutional initiative takes on all these other characteristics, which, we'll talk about international law creating unintended consequences. So then you're asked to write chapters about Asian international law. What would that be? I mean, from the Mediterranean to the Pacific, I mean, all, Islam, Judaism, anyway, you can see the problems there. What I'd like to think about is, and here, my own interest at this stage is to prevent any account of Asian international law being a purely regional account. On one hand, but also allowing much smaller accounts. The concept of the region should not be the dominating theme, or at least it should not be the only theme. So there should be smaller accounts, more micro accounts, and larger accounts taking place simultaneously. So here I would say do whatever you think is interesting to you. Write the history of sugar, as Michael Fakhri did, or write the history of a particular scholar. I mean, I'm very interested, like Root. So I found out a bit about his engagement with Latin America because I had a glance at the book that is to be launched shortly. And for me, of course, it's interesting that it was exactly at the same time that Root was creating the system of governance in the Philippines. So how do we think about these things, how these sort of different histories but are connected histories in some respect. So that's not very sort of satisfactory, but I guess the other interest I have is the moment when the concept of the third world really comes into some kind of intellectual coherence. And I do believe there was that moment. It wasn't perhaps at Bandung because the Latin American states were not there. But it's very interesting reading someone like R.P. Anand in his early works where he draws upon Latin American writers. And he sees the connections between the problems of Asia, and they are the same problems, which have to do with state responsibility, and the problems of Africa and Asia. So I'm interested in that moment when there's an attempt by the major scholars to kind of connect with each other in a very direct way. So that's something that interests me, and that's something I'm working on. Thanks.
So thank you. I'm only going to do one question in order you ask on the people that have other questions. Okay, last night during the dinner, Liliana made a beautiful and lovely ajiaco. And we were explaining to Professor Marty Koskeniami how was made ajiaco. And we realized it was a post-colonial element in the ajiaco, the Creole potatoes. We hadn't realized that. So we were wondering last night when and how was introduced this critical legal thinking in Latin America, and especially in international law. And in some extent, in some point, we realized that the critical questions and the critical thinking arrive later to faculties of law than other faculties and other thinkings. For instance, I don't know, anthropology, geography, history. So in Latin America, there are a huge knowledge about the questions that we are making now. For instance, I don't know, I'm thinking about Arturo Escobar, I'm thinking about Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui, I'm thinking about other decolonial authors. So my question is how we as critical legal scholars from international law can dialogue with these existing thinkings that already have made some questions that we are making now. And in concrete, how can we write new legal histories that are transdisciplinary, transgeographic, and include sociocultural, economic, environmental, and political context? So I don't know, want to start?
So it seems to me that this is a reformulation of something that we debated yesterday already, which had to do with interdisciplinarity and what kinds of things we can expect to receive from other disciplines I think Anne responds, at least to me, quite exhaustively in relationship to what we can expect to have from history. So I have nothing to add to that, the discipline of history. What about the other disciplines, sociology, philosophy, politics, international relations? How does that help us in writing historical works, if it does help us at all? Now, so I'm at an angry moment. I published this article on counterdisciplinarity, and I felt one has to end this thing with relationships with other disciplines. So if it works, it works, and it's like Tony used the metaphor of a bad date. So sometimes it's a bad date, sometimes it's okay, and you know, even a love affair might last while it lasts, and so it's really hard to say anything general about the way in which people should use other disciplines in the historical, or indeed in other writings. So I think one aspect of this historical debate that hasn't, it underlies both what Tony and Anne has said, but I want to put it more express, is that, well, as lawyers, doing the very core, or working with the very core legal questions, let's say, for instance, in preparing advice for a government that prepares for a conference, or preparing for a case, investment or boundary delimitation, etc. What we do as lawyers is, well, we go to the archives. And I remember when I was still working as a legal advisor to the Finnish government, so the persons who, you know, so in the evening everybody went home from the foreign ministry, and the only places where you could see light still was the light in the archive, and it was the lawyer who was in the archive reading this stuff in order to prepare for the advice that he or she would then give. And I certainly have spent quite a number of nights, sleepless nights, in preparing both cases and advice, in going through diplomatic materials from the 19th century, etc., producing interpretations, trying to understand, and of course all of this understanding and interpretation production being directed towards producing a legally competent and efficient advice for whatever purpose it is that one does. And I now confront this question. So how does in my limited interdisciplinary reading ever helped in that work, for example? And I suppose it helped in the sense that, well, you had a base on which you could measure the other party's expectations and a certain set of standards about what it is that you have to speak to when you make an argument that inevitably deals with, let's say, in the Latin American context, uti possidetis, how it was applied in the early part of the 19th century. So you need to know that, yeah, well, there were revolutions, you need to know a number of facts, you need to know something about how archival texts are interpreted, you need to know something about the political histories of the other countries. But I have to say, it's not been, so none of this was really crucial or essential. Now you might want to say, well, but that's not interesting because that's just boring legal bureaucratic stuff, and we are all here intellectuals. We are in a university, was established in the 17th century. You know, we carry a scholastic inheritance, and we are, you know, interpreting the world to students and thinking hard and deep about these things. What about that perspective? So I'm thinking, well, okay, so this university was established, there must have been the philosophy faculty first and the three higher faculties, and how did they relate at the time? One part of the historical work that I'm doing now tries to provide an account of how expertise develops and how expertise emerges and becomes widely appreciated so that the people in that expertise have a grasp at power, and how that appreciation then vanishes because other people seem to be more exciting experts in some new discipline. And there is a story to be told. It's about 500 years that goes from theology to law to economics. And I'm thinking of interdisciplinary work also, and perhaps not only also, but above all, as a series of hegemonic maneuvers in which people from the economic side, from the sociologist side, from the lawyer side, etc., are constantly struggling in order to create a voice that would sound authoritative in the ears of those who exercise power. And so I never felt that when I'm in an interdisciplinary context that we are engaged in a common enterprise and that we hold hands and together about some deep problem in order to bring our shared knowledges together so that at the end we can have a drink and say, well, we did it. But I feel, I'm threatened by this guy and I just don't understand what he's saying, but it sounds really brilliant and that's very worrying. And how can I, exercise a maneuver on my own turf so that, et cetera, et cetera. So it's like that. It's a human relationship, and I suppose I'm getting towards where dates become either bad dates or good dates or love affairs or not so much love as other things. So, so I think in the daily, so there are these two contexts. The lawyer as somebody preparing a legal service, and a lawyer thinking of themselves as intellectuals in an academic environment. Well, in those two contexts, the lawyer has a different relationship to the adjoining disciplines. In the former, his or her professionalism, expertise, and grasp at power is not being questioned. On the contrary, it's being expected that the lawyer will solve the thing. And so that's a pleasurable thing. And you just instrumentalize those other people to the extent that they seem useful and then forget about them. And that's what you should do in order to, when you prepare a good legal advice. Then you are in this university and you see these turf struggles and you know that the money is scarce and you know which faculty gets what funding and these new positions. And those, then that context is a context of tension. There's a moment of excitement and now I'm winning, now I'm losing. And you try to manage that the best you can. But in the way, and that of course all plays into how then you show yourself to the world in your writings, in your PhD work, in the books that you will produce later on. Are you somebody that people want to listen to? Are you somebody that needs to be invited to a conference to speak to people who will then either take your advice or don't take your advice? So I'm sorry that this doesn't really, I notice, end in a really clear-cut theory about interdisciplinarity in either one of these contexts. I don't have such theory. I think of these encounters in terms of human encounters where all of us have our human ambitions and fears, which we try to juggle with. And that's the way I at least go about
it. Well, I think I mentioned my own personal approach to interdisciplinarity, which is I feel I've got a problem that I'm trying to solve, and I kind of borrow and, how should I say, expropriate or whatever it is from various other disciplines to the extent that I feel it helps me deal better with the particular issue that I'm trying to address. I mean, I can, as I did yesterday, I can give examples of ideas or approaches I took from other disciplines in a very actually crude sort of way. I just grabbed certain ideas which I found interesting from postcolonialism or from André Gunder Frank, just to help me think about, well, legal materials and the type of scholarship I was doing. I completely agree with Anne, the comment she made yesterday, which is I think it's a mistake to feel that the answer is going to be found in some other discipline. That seems to be exactly right. It's like the PhD student who's looking for the article that will finally provide a solution to their they have a particular problem. But then, of course, there's another problem, because if you find that article, then what's the point of writing your PhD? So there's that sort of tension that is experienced in that way. I think there's a whole issue of the politics of interdisciplinarity, which Marty has dealt with very well. And also, maybe we'll discuss this tomorrow in the context of teaching and research. I won't say people are being compelled to do interdisciplinary work, but I noticed that in so many cases in my university, there are grants being given if you do interdisciplinary work. And so people cobble together some sort of interdisciplinary project, and those can go terribly wrong. I don't want to use the bad date analogy yet again, but it's easy to see several examples of that sort of false, opportunistic type of interdisciplinarity producing very bad work.
Thank you. So your question was a how question. How can we as critical scholars dialogue with existing thinking in other fields? And so I want to come at it as a how question. And you can probably tell that I'm more interested in how questions than Tony, but as a very practical thing. So I'm interested in the question of method because I think it's a question that I have to pose before I start doing work in any particular moment. And because time is short, the how question goes to the question precisely of what is international law a history of. So that's a question that I've been asking myself all the way through this project I mentioned yesterday that I'm about to finish. And I think it's not a question that has an innocent answer. So what is international law is not something we answer once and for all. And every time we answer that question, we're posing an account of what we think international law is. We also always put that account within a narrative of progress or its opposite. And we then engage with a field that, as I've said, is organised around the movement of meaning through these rhetorically dense concepts that are informed by philosophies, economies, sociologies, and so on. So there is where I would be looking to engage with the other discipline, to understand what efficiency means and the enormous political struggles that have gone on over that term and embedding it in your constitution, for instance. Which political economists or which economists are going to help me understand not only what it means, but how to make it mean something else, something that leads towards the future that I want to see or that my movement or my client or my country want to see realised in the world. And that meaning will always move in a contested field. So then we see that we can't impose a theory of history on international law. We're already operating within a dialectical account of the movement of meaning that will take place across this contested field. So if you read a legal archive without understanding that is its operation, you end up reproducing that account. So to take one example, I've used this before, but I think Isabel Hull's latest book, I think her earlier book on German military thinking as it moves from empire back into Germany really is attuned to the movement of meaning through institutional processes. But her more recent book, A Scrap of Paper, seems to me to participate in a construction of a history of international law, which in a footnote, I think in the preface, she says, for these purposes will be the history of war and peace only, and then says, and by the way, it'll be out of 3 archives. So as Sheila Fitzpatrick has commented in writing about Russia, you fall in love with your archive and you produce the account of that archive and from the point of view of that archive. So she always felt that the Soviet Union was wrong to close off some of its more contentious archives. It should open them up and then every scholar would end up advocating the gulags. And I think there is that kind of character to engaging with an archive. So as an international law scholar, you need to understand that there is already a theory of movement and meaning built into the way that international law works. So, how to do something as a critical scholar is never an interesting question. We're presented, as we've been saying, with concepts that are frozen. If we're critical, we're wanting to unfreeze them. We're trying to make them do something else. We're trying to stop them being politically not volatile and make them volatile again. So make efficiency something that you can't just use as if you have the answer. Make it something that is really a site of struggle. And then at the same time, think about challenging, how to challenge the dominant telos. If the dominant story is that everything's natural, make it look unnatural. But if the dominant story is that everything's unnatural, this could be Trump at the moment, then make it look supernatural. So there's not one story that we're trying to tell. So what we're trying to work with is to make all of this material something that we can use consciously as part of the way in which we narrate the world.
Okay, thank you very much for all your comments. And I'm going to be a little bit selfish here with this question. I don't have to, and it's pretty naive, in fact. One of the things that I have found trying to study some history is that I have found tons of information everywhere, and it's been very difficult to put it together and to come up with something. That it's one thing that. What advice would you give the three of you to beginners to proceed in a rational and efficient way? And you can come up with your own definition of efficiency in this. So, and to approach to the history of international law. That would be one question. And the other one, I would like to follow on something about that the three of you mentioned already about power. And as Anne put it, and I understood it, okay, concepts and ideas travel through the suitcases and in the hands of lawyers, and who use them for or in war powers, we could say something like that. So one of my questions would be, and perhaps to Anna, and for you two also, what changes the understanding through time of those concepts? Power, and related with economic interest? I always go back through power, and I just say, where is the money? So who wants the money? And we will find it, lots of explanations. That would be all. Who would like to start with this? You haven't started yet with one of the questions, so I will handle to you.
Okay, right. The question about sort of endless materials, I think that was the question. It really is a very interesting, important, and to me, difficult question to answer. Because you start writing something with a particular, I mean, as we write something, we continuously formulate, you could say, arguments or models or some sort of thesis about the materials. And then the danger is once you do that, you add some other material to the argument you formulated, and it changes things completely. And you can see then that on one hand, it could be an endless process. I think maybe it's another South American writer, Borges, who had this story about a map that had to represent a particular area. And then, of course, the map became the area. So you just keep going on and on and on. And I think, for me at least, I can, well, perhaps I'm saying the obvious. I can only answer this personally. What I'm trying to do is not present comprehensive histories of whatever I'm writing about. So it's not the Borges map thing. What I'm trying to do is to suggest a set of arguments which might then be used as a sort of heuristic device to think about events or to think about histories. So to go back to what I mentioned earlier, maybe if we look at particular writers or particular events or particular cases, the civilized, uncivilized distinction provides us with an illuminating reading of those events. So I see what I'm doing as just trying to present a set of heuristic devices with enough historical background to give them some plausibility so that they can't be dismissed instantly and saying, this is nonsense. And in the end, it may be that the arguments I'm making are wrong, or they might be illuminating, I'm not quite sure. But at least in terms of my own scholarship, that's how I try to impose limits, because otherwise it is endless. I mean, we can see the League of Nations. I mean, how do we really come to terms with that? We can see already numerous books being written about it, people doing work in the archives. But then what about the archives in New Zealand? Have people looked at the archives in New Zealand, or have they looked at the archives in, there's always another archive in these types of circumstances. So again, I'm rather glad that I wrote about the League of Nations before it became a whole industry in itself, because I would have felt paralyzed in those types of circumstances. So that's very sort of inadequate, but that's the best I can do in terms of my own approach to this issue. I suppose another, I'll leave it at that.
So I'm really the wrong person to answer the question as to how does one write efficiently and direct students in doing that. So my present work has now turned into its second decade. And my contract with Cambridge University Press about this book that I am writing says I should deliver it in the autumn of 2011. So the material, so the problem is large. And I have to confess that, so this is a historical work. It's a work about, people could say it's a work in the history of ideas in international law from the late medieval period to 1800. So it's a prequel to my previous book, The Gentle Civilizer of Nations, which started in 1870. So it's an answer to the question, what existed in terms of international law before 1870? And I noticed that many things existed before 1870, and to put those things in some order is really, really hard. And here I am now. The second decade had started with this book already some time ago. But something I have learned, and one thing that I can say as a pragmatic piece of information is that when I started this work, I was very influenced by the methodological discussions that we've now, the three of us have more or less condemned as useless or misleading. But so I started, and this suggested to me that I should know the contexts very well. So I've read a lot of economic history, for instance, in the late medieval period of the organization of the Holy Roman Empire and the British Empire. Enormous amounts of stuff, also political history, etc. Most of the last 5 years or so I've spent trying to forget that, because it didn't really add up to my understanding of how law operates. In the course of these years, I found that, and this links to my previous response, that I found that what I am really interested in is how legal imagination operates with the materials that's handed out to it. And this means that I should have to go to the primary sources and read these guys. So take up again Grotius and all the 1,800 pages of the De Jure Belliac Pacis in the Liberty Fund edition, and just read it, and then go and read a novel, during the weekend, and from that novel get the space of imagination for myself that enables me to read Grotius with fresh eyes and with some ability to play around with his texts. And I find that's so much more productive and efficient than reading yet another history of Latin American economy from 1492 to 1513. I mean, these are interesting and important books, but if efficiency is the issue, then just leave them aside. So it's a kind of a stupid thing. So primary materials, try to remember that it's the work of the legal imagination that you deal with if you're writing a legal history. How do these lawyers imagine the worlds they deal with? Then there's the question of the concepts. So how do concepts change? And I have something to say about that question, which I'm not sure how that links to making students write efficiently on historical topics. But so law, I mean, this is of course contestable, because every proposition like this is contestable, which starts by saying law is something. But here it is. I say law is a system of persuasion. Law is a practice of persuasion. Law is a way in which we formulate arguments through which we try to persuade authorities, other people, etc., towards those preferences that we have. In that process of persuasion and argumentation, we use concepts. And those concepts are, as well, somebody yesterday mentioned, the unnameable Nazi. That unnameable, well-known Nazi used to say that legal concepts are fighting concepts. And I think that's right. So in the process of persuasion, we construct the concepts that we use as fighting concepts. We give them meanings that best enhance the kinds of arguments that we want to make. We want to use those concepts as powerful tools in our argumentative materiel. And so if the question is, how do concepts change? And if this is the perspective in which one legally thinks about concepts, then of course there isn't a single meaning to a concept. That every concept is constantly the platform of struggle. People try to invest those concepts with meanings that support their preferences, that helps them to argue cases that they want to argue, and their adversaries give those very same concepts other meanings, opposite meanings. And much of legal history, I suppose, is about that constant creation and recreation of the meanings of legal concepts. Some meanings become hegemonic at moments, and they survive as hegemonic concepts until something happens and other people are able to put forward more plausible meaning contents to a concept, and that's how it goes. So I'm often asked as an international lawyer, it may be natural that one is asked the question, well, what does international law have to say about that? And then I find myself, and especially if it's a public event, and I find myself, oh God, not again, that question. I can tell you what we can make international law to say in view of some interests that we perform. So I've been trained as a legal advisor for a government, and I can say from the perspective of the kinds of interests and preferences my government wants to put forward that law says X, Y, and Z. But I suppose there's a legal realist background to the idea that law isn't there to be grasped, so that you can say to a journalist when he or she asks you, what does the law say, in full honesty, that this is what the law says. Now, of course, then in the end, you forget about the anguish and you give a response, and the response will unsurprisingly be quite close to your political preferences and your views about how some situation should be resolved and who are the baddies and who are the goodies, and all of this will be condensed in your view when you say it with a deep voice of authority. This is what international law says. I made earlier the distinction between law as craft and law as intellectual discipline. Because I've been for a long time what they call a legal practitioner, I've felt in my own life very concretely the difficulty sometimes of moving from one context to another. How does one move from craftsmanship to intellectual thinking? I don't have a general theory about that. I often run away from the kitchen door by responding by saying, well, the intellectual context too is a kind of craftsmanship. It's a different kind of a craftsmanship in which you have different kinds of authorities to which you refer to. So you don't say Derrida when you plead in front of the ICJ, but you might say Derrida when you're in Bogota, for instance, speaking to an audience of public international lawyers. Or not. It's all about whom do you want to persuade in which ways. Okay, I think I made the point already.
So thank you, Jose Manuel. Let me start with the efficiency question. And Marty, I'm interested because I think I'm really the wrong person to answer the question of how to write efficiently. So perhaps we all feel that way. It's very true, I think, when you try and produce an account of international law that has any historical consciousness, that you come across the question of what is the object of study here. And I think lawyers have had one set of answers to that question. We tend to deal with the enormity of what international law is and has become by working in fields. So we might then specialise as a human rights lawyer or a refugee lawyer or an investment lawyer. That's how we deal with the enormity of that question. And historians, of course, deal with periodisation as one answer to the enormity of the question. If what you're trying to produce is a new image, a new object of study, if you're trying to produce a new understanding of international law, then of course you have to find another way of making the kind of decision about efficiency, because the how to tell the story question has to be linked up with what it is you want to bring in, what you want to reveal. So there is no right answer to that question, and nor is there an answer that's stable. So for me, the answer to how to do it goes back and forwards with what you see when you try and produce the account. For me, it has to relate to what international law in the world is today, and specifically, as I said yesterday, the project I'm working on at the moment tries to understand the interrelationship of international law and a project of economic ordering that produces extreme vulnerability in an uneven basis. So what forms of international law, what histories of international law would have to be told so I can grasp that better and communicate that history in a way that makes it seem then more amenable to political action. So the how to do it question is enormously tied up with what it is you're trying to show and how to do that effectively. I have to say it has become more and more enormous to try and do that in a way that seems accurate but communicable and compelling. And since we're in Rosario, I'm going to use this slightly overblown metaphor, but all the time I talk about method, it's really to prepare the ground for the work that I'm trying to bring into being, because the methodological constraints that are imposed on histories of international law would have made the project I'm doing just seem illegitimate. And I was keen for it not to appear in the world as something illegitimate. So the inappropriate metaphor is the work on method is kind of John the Baptist preparing the way for, there's the inappropriate part. So obviously it's not going to be quite like that. So then we go to the question of how concepts and ideas travel, and this is precisely the question we couldn't ask if we were not wanting to be Whiggish or not wanting to be in breach of the rules of the Cambridge School. How ideas and concepts travel, and how they also are resistant to change. So I was thinking about that in the context of the signs outside marking moments of revolution. And one of the things that international law does very powerfully is move concepts across moments of rupture. So how do you keep protecting investments even across moments of revolution? How do you keep a world order in place even as people in specific parts of the world think they're changing everything? And international law is a really key site for ensuring that certain kinds of meanings move across those temporal moments. But the question of how that happens has to be an empirical one. And I don't think the question is even answerable across the fields at one moment in history, let alone across different fields. So the book that I'm, God willing, going to finish one day tries to look at how these different ideas move across fields of trade, investment, non-intervention, freedom of movement, and rights. And each of those are conceptual schemas that exist in an architecture in relation to each other that shifts at different moments. And the way in which those different fields transmit meaning are all really quite distinct. So to give one example from the area of the GATT and the World Trade Organization, there I think you see an extraordinary capacity to embed and transmit meaning, hugely contested philosophical and economical accounts of what the state can do in the world. That would take us back to, you know, the 16th century, the 17th century, what it is to be in a community. There's an answer to those questions embedded in these trade agreements, which lawyers transmit and hand on every day. And if we opened those questions up again to philosophical or political discussion, they would be seen as hugely radical. But I've been at many conferences where WTO lawyers sit on the stage and say, well, we just have to be pragmatic. This is an institution in the world now, and you'd be really a radical anarchist if you wanted to take on the questions. We just have to work with these agreements rather than, you know, try and blow them up. But other than the past 30 years, what's in those agreements would have been the matter for blowing things up. So how is it that lawyers participate in making things appear completely uncontestable? So that's an empirical question, I think, and it's a really important one, and there's no one answer to it, but I truly think that that is why we need to insist on protocols that are true to the work we're doing.
I don't know how we are doing with time. Okay. Yeah, okay. Then we're open to the floor for some questions. 1, 2, okay. Okay. Yeah, well, okay.
Yeah. Juana Maya Castro, Los Andes. So I want to give another spin to the carousel. What is the history of international law, the history of? What is the history of power, the history of? And if it's about the production and dissemination and passing on of legal concepts, what is the thing that makes some production, some legal concepts successful, others not? Is it the institutions that amplify? Is it some external moment, event? Or is it is the history of power the history of empires in succession, or the idea of empire that somehow reproduces itself in different epochs and different moments? And I'm not just asking this question just to give a turn to the carousel, but more specifically, I would like to know how you relate to this when you teach, especially in view of this political economy of teaching, the limitations in time, attention span, and everything.
Thank you very much. I'll be very short. I think something we all can agree on is that we need to challenge Whiggish, Eurocentric visions of the history of international law. But my question, ethical, methodological, political, is what should we do or can we do when there are Whiggish, anachronical, post-colonial readings of international law? Something that I fear a lot in the field of human rights is that something I'm seeing is that there are like these post-colonial revendications of history of human rights in post-colonial settings, which I think are very Whiggish too in their nature. So how can we interact when the critics are doing anachronical history in a sense?
Good morning, everyone. Thanks again for your presentations and your thoughts. I profoundly appreciate the reivindication behind all of your stances, but I have to ask, isn't the answer to the question posed by the history of international law, the purpose of that history, always law? And I want to perhaps elaborate a bit on this. I feel that when you say that we tell the history of international law so that we can dispel with the notion that the present is a necessity in order to open up alternatives for the future, the only way in which we can then modify those potential scenarios that will govern future relations is through the law, especially if we're contesting the just nature, the faithfulness to human purpose or enterprise of international treaties and agreements, for instance. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for your thoughts. I am a PhD student trying to deal with the interdisciplinary methods and challenges, and I would like to hear your thoughts and experience about how you deal with the comparisons. I feel like all this discussion has to do with how you compare things, events, time, countries, and I feel that's a big issue.
Okay, so Juana Maya Castro's question was about, I suppose, the determining force of the way in which law creates its concepts and passes them on. And how do we speak to students? How do we explain to students those determining forces? What is it that makes law become something and makes it to form as an institution at some historical point in which it privileges some interests over other interests? And that's a really, really difficult question. And in order to be able to tell legal history in terms of those kinds of causalities, we should really read every book that has ever written. And so the Cambridge University Press would really have to wait until doomsday before this book of mine would be finished. So I can only say how I operate in terms of those causalities, and others may then either agree with that or think of this as wholly unethical and unacceptable. So I think the work of history that I do is a work of writing. And it's a work of writing that hopes to have an effect in the reader. I have my own political views about the world, what it is that has made the world the disaster that it is. I have a pretty clear sense for myself about who are the baddies and who are the goodies. Now, in writing, all of this obviously they're in the background influencing the writing. But also other things influence that writing, including the novels that I read every now and then, and that make me interested in history writing as literature. And those novels teach me something about how it is that you create the effect in the reader, that the reader remains interested and might even be persuaded by the text. And one thing that I've learned in which one can miserably fail in maintaining the reader's interest or persuading the reader is to try to push down the throat of a reader some preconceived conclusion about the way the world is. And making a writing in view of accounts about what it is that determines things in this life is to make the aesthetic mistake of pushing down the throat of the reader some preconceived, better or worse, usually worse, thought out series of causal relationships. Now, I already yesterday declared that I'm an incompetent expert because I don't know how the world should be ruled so that the disaster that it is would go away. I don't know that. And so how do I write in that situation? Well, I write in a way that the reader would not feel that he or she is being fed some half-cooked Marxist story about great corporations or the material forces of society that determine the legal concepts, etc. I never put those kinds of things in my texts. But what I've learned from novels, and not least for classical novels, is that tragedy is a genre in which often grasps people's ability to follow the story, their own imagination of what the world is like, and often their own experiences. Many people, and especially in people that I want to be in conversation with, have an experience about tragedy. And so I think those people are able themselves to fulfill the dots that I can't fulfill them for themselves. So here I come to the end of how I write. So I try to write in such a way that my writing remains interesting. It's problematic and often self-contradictory. I think interesting writing is like that. It's because so I don't want to produce solutions. Instead, I want to take the reader to a place where he and she can say, yes, this is a world that I acknowledge. I recognize these things, these paradoxes and problems, these tragedies. I know they are there. And I have, through my own experience, the reader, I can fulfill the slots. I know what's wrong. I know who the baddies are. I know what the forces are that have created this disaster. And I know what this author is trying to tell me. And so if you're a reader like I am, if the author tells you, and ergo, this is why the world is like it is, I would immediately, the contrarian would come up, oh, it can't be like that. No, that's too simple. So I never say that. I just tell them, think for yourself, and here are some materials. And try to organize the materials in such a way that the kind of view about what it is that determines things in the world that the reader will then use would be the kind of view of the world that I have. So I know that I won't be invited to academic conferences after having revealed that, and maybe Cambridge will renounce the contract. So there were 4 questions, but I've given long enough answer to one question, so I'll just pass on to my fellow victims.
So to Han's question, well, what a question. I mean, I don't know how we could, well, Aristotle, something like the subject matter will only allow as much precision. No, you can only answer a question to the extent that the subject matter will allow. That's the sort of crude version of it. But basically, I don't know how to answer the question, and I don't know when it could be said that there is an answer to the question. Now, of course, there are all sorts of social scientists, perhaps, who say there is an answer to this question, and it might be a Marxist argument. It might be imperialism. I don't want to commit myself to that type of dogmatism, and I feel that now, in terms of my own writing, so I'm reverting to, in a sense, borrowing Marty's technique, we're now shifting to another realm. We've been discussing law, we've been discussing history, but really what we're talking about is literature. And so, in a way, I think of what I'm trying to achieve. It's actually quite comparable to what Marty says, but I am going to invoke another writer here, and that writer is Joseph Conrad, Nostromo. I keep wondering about how Nostromo applies to Latin America at the moment. But one of the things that Conrad said about his ambition as a writer, he said, my ambition above all is to make people see. That is all, and that is everything. So that's a pretty good summary of what I'm trying to achieve myself. And it is not to provide an answer. It is to make people see and to convince them that they are part of this world, that there are connections, relationships that they are engaged with. It might be, deep in the Congo, but, this is part of the condition of which we share a portion. And then we have to respond. So I think that would be the way I would present that. To Daniel's question, Daniel, I think you have certain writers in mind. whom you haven't mentioned, and I think maybe we should have a discussion about those particular writers and those particular texts. The other question, I think, the way I read the question was the suggestion of, well, we can do all these things, but in the end, we have to return to law. In other words, you know, perhaps the question could be put in another way. You know, we claim to be political, we want another world, but in order to make that world a reality, in the end, we are going to have to return to law. We're going to have to come up with a treaty banning nuclear weapons, or come up with a treaty that will stop environmental degradation, and so forth. I think that's based on an idea of the law, which we ourselves have been continuously questioning here. And so, so I think that's, I mean, the precise project here in many ways, or I think many of us are saying, the idea of the law itself is problematic. And so having pointed to all these complications, we can't then say, well, and actually when we come to the solution, law is not problematic. You know, we can come up with a treaty and that will resolve everything. So I think we're really caught in a complicated situation. I think some of us operate at multiple levels at once. On one hand, we would like a treaty banning nuclear weapons. But at the same time, we understand that the critical part of ourselves understand that there are so many complications associated with that, right? So this is a TWAIL problem as well, which is on one hand, the argument that some people make of TWAIL, which is we've got such a critique of international law that we should dispense with the law entirely. Because after we provide the critique, there's nothing left standing and we'll be contradicting our own critique. And that's a tension, that's a complication, and we haven't been able to resolve that. But at a practical level, we would say, yes, it would be good if the Marshall Islands case had been different, at the very least. But we know that this is only a part of a larger, complex situation. There's another type of answer which I think emerged from the very interesting panel I attended yesterday, dealing with indigenous people. And the question was, how do indigenous people express their realities without the protocols of the law? In other words, we come to a radically different idea of society, of order, of governance, of the environment, of the person, everything else. And that radicality cannot be contained in the idea of law. We can't bring law back in. So I think we have the same question being played out in a very real, concrete situation in that context as well. And I think it's a very urgent question, and I'm not sure what more to say about that. Thanks.
For speedy answers. Juanamaya, thank you. What is the international law, the history of? What is the history of power, the history of? And are they the same thing? I never quite know what power means. I'm the same. I don't quite know what people are asking when they ask me questions about power exactly. But I would say that I take a slightly different approach to Marty with focusing on the imagination of the individual lawyers or David Kennedy's people with projects or Quentin Skinner's innovating ideologists. So I think that I'm interested, I think they embody theories of power and theories of change and theories of history that I'm trying to work against to a degree. I think there's a kind of a certain individualism there that I am not sure is part of the self-representation of how meaning moves in law. So I've been thinking about this also in relation to writing a paper about how revolutions are remembered in international law and history. And there's one way in which you can write, say, an account of the Soviet Union or of Maoist China, where you show that it's all about people with projects, all about self-interested innovating politicians, using the ideology of revolution and communism in a starkly cynical way. And you could tell the whole story of both of those revolutions and of the history of those countries like that, but you'd miss a lot. So now there are some really fascinating, there have been for a long time, but Michael Dutton in Chinese history, Sheila Fitzpatrick in Russian history, trying to write accounts or literature like Svetlana Alexievich, I'm radically mispronouncing, that try and get inside what it is to believe in the theory of history that the revolution embodies. And if you try and tell the story like that, you learn something new, you learn something else. And you don't just learn about powerful men and their projects. It's good to know both of those things. You need to know how powerful men think, but you also need to know other theories of history. So I'm interested in, can we tell other theories of history? So that, and I think international law embodies some, and I'm trying to articulate them. Daniel, we need to challenge Whiggish Eurocentric histories of international law and Whiggish post-colonial readings. We need to ... So you could probably tell I'm slightly concerned about dogma, and I think dogma is always consolidated and intensified in international law because we are an authoritarian field. We are a field organised around authorities. We really defer to authorities, which can be fun if for some reason someone thinks you're an authority, but most of the time it's a problem. So when you say we need to challenge, again, I would just want to stress, why do we need to? So if we put in the place of Whiggish, Victor's, not Victor the person, but Victor the winner, so Victor's histories of international law, then I think I would agree. And I do think that's what Butterfield was trying to say. At his point in England, in the history of England, he was, pushing back against Anglican and, specifically Protestant and liberal accounts of what England was becoming, and he wanted to open up the question of what that was. So we need to push back against Victor's accounts of history if we want to resist them. And if that's the case, then I think I would be very interested in a conversation about that. But just the proposition that we need to, because we're told we should be against, I'm not for that account. Isn't the answer to the question posed by history of international law always law? No. But I could say a bit more. It would depend on what the question is, what you think the question posed by the history of international law is. I would have many questions posed by the history of international law. The answer to some of them might be law, but then my further question would be, who's asking? And what form of law have you got in mind? So the answer might be one form of law and not another. It might be this kind of law and not that. It might be a liberal version of law. It might be a Bolshevik version of law. So, I mean, there's not an answer that is law. There are many answers to the many questions posed by history. And finally, I think that's absolutely spot on, that many of the questions that arise when we think about addressing the past in a properly contextualized form are also questions that come up in comparative legal theory when we're trying to look at other countries. And we get the similar kind of anxieties. Can I really understand this other time, this other place, if I don't fully become part of that time? Can I forget where I am and who I am and the time or place in which I'm operating in order to fully understand those other ways of thinking and being or doing law? I think the questions are very complex, both in terms of historiography, as we've been discussing, but we would have an equally complicated discussion about comparative method. And of course, there are a lot of people doing really interesting comparative work now in international law. I do think, though, that even trying to produce any account or history of international law that doesn't try and at least keep some attention to the fact that this, as I've been saying, is a dialectical field, so that if you just give one side of the story, you're always just going to be giving ideology. So then the attempt is trying to excavate other accounts. I mean, it's almost impossible as an ambition, but I think nonetheless it's really important to produce something that doesn't just become, as I've been saying, an ideology.
Okay, so thank you very much for this inspiring panel, and everyone for your patience. We are going to meet here again in 10 minutes, and there are some coffee and snacks outside, so well deserved, so thank you very much.